Have you ever felt like someone who passed away tried to communicate with you? Not in a dream, not in a stray memory of the day, but in a way so real, so powerful, that it seemed impossible it could be just imagination? What we call a sign, and which many prefer to ignore, can actually be one of the most powerful ways for two worlds to reconnect. And what you're about to hear now may make you look at life and what comes next with different eyes. It was dawn. Total silence in the house, my body tired, my mind still trying to calm down. I closed my eyes like any other night. But what came next was unusual. It was like being in two places at once. Suddenly, I saw him, my grandfather, standing a few feet away from me, smiling, a calm, almost familiar smile, as if he were exactly where he should be. But there was something more. He didn't say a word. He just pointed, and he was pointing at Earth. At that moment, I didn't know what to think. Was it a dream, a delusion, a vision? All I know is that his gesture stuck with me in a way no words could explain. It was as if that simple action, a finger silently pointing here toward our world, said more than 1,000 sentences, as if there were a message there, waiting to be understood. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever felt like someone dear to you, no longer with us, was trying to show you something? Perhaps through a misplaced object, a repeated phrase in a dream, a subtle presence in the environment? These spiritual encounters don't follow logic. They follow connection. And when love is true, not even death can end the dialogue. Ever since that night, the image of my grandfather pointing to Earth has haunted me, but not in a frightening way. It's like a reminder, a calling, something I still needed to understand. And what you're about to discover now may surprise you, because what came after that changed everything. And now I want to go even deeper into this subject. My grandfather was always the kind of person who seemed to carry the whole world in his eyes. He didn't talk much, but when he did, each word seemed to carry a different weight, as if there was a hidden truth in everything he said. He had strong hands, marked by time and work, but a gentle way of holding things, as if he knew the value of every detail. Ever since I was little, I felt safe by his side. He was the kind of person who didn't need to do much to be a giant in his presence. Just being there made everything feel lighter. Some of my most vivid childhood memories are tied to him. The slow Sundays, the leisurely coffee, the advice disguised as old stories. I remember how he had a habit of looking up at the sky and falling silent, as if listening to something others couldn't. I didn't understand it at the time, but today I think he was already walking between two worlds long before he left. Our connection went beyond mere cohabitation. It was as if we had our own language, made of glances and silences. No explanation was needed, and perhaps that's why, when he left, the void that remained was more than a physical absence. It was like losing a part of your inner compass, that beacon of calm wisdom, that silent voice that reminds you of what truly matters, even when the world seems to demand otherwise. The goodbye was quick, and maybe that's why it hurt so much. I didn't have time to say everything I wanted to. I didn't have time to thank him. And when we don't say goodbye properly, it leaves a wound that doesn't bleed on the outside, but corrodes on the inside. His silence, which once felt like comfort, was now an absence. The chair on the porch was still there. The smell of coffee still appeared occasionally, but he didn't come back. For a while, I tried to rationalize the pain, to bury with him everything that was too difficult to face. But there are things time doesn't erase. It only rearranges them. And his memory, instead of fading, became even more present. It was as if my grandfather had become part of the emotional landscape of my life. He was in everything. In the way I looked at the sky, in the way I listened to people, even in the smallest decisions. It was as if he continued to speak to me in a different way, more subtle, more internal, but still real. And that's why, when I had that experience, that vision, that dream, or whatever it was, I wasn't surprised by his smile. It was the same smile as before, the same one that welcomed me on so many silent mornings. But in that moment, in that place I can't explain, that smile held something more. It had purpose, direction. And when he pointed to Earth without saying a word, something inside me trembled. It was as if he were reminding me of something I'd forgotten, a kind of calling, a mission, a presence that still needed to be fulfilled. The strangest thing is that that seemingly simple gesture carried an absurd depth. It wasn't just a pointing, it was a direction, a return, as if he were saying, "It's not your time to come yet, you need to stay there." And I kept that in my head for days. What exactly was he trying to show me? What on earth was he trying to get me to see or do? Was it a warning? A nudge? A reminder of purpose? These questions began to reorganize my certainties. I began to look around differently, to observe people with more intention, to pay more attention to signs, to synchronicities. I began to realize that perhaps death is not a full stop, but a comma in the middle of something much larger, and that sometimes, even after they're gone, those who love us still find ways to guide us. But we need to be attentive. We need to learn to listen with different senses, with different sensitivity. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because his gesture, that simple pointing movement, was just the beginning of a series of revelations that completely changed the way I view the invisible. What happens after death? That was the question that began to resonate more strongly after my grandfather passed away. It didn't come as a philosophical curiosity, but as a gaping hole in my chest, the kind that only appears when someone who was part of the fabric of your life is simply no longer there. For me, mourning didn't begin at the funeral. It began the next day, when I looked at the spot where he used to sit, and silence replaced his presence. It was a kind of void that made no noise but weighed down the atmosphere. For the first few days, everything felt numb. I went about my daily routine saying I was fine, but inside, I was moving in slow motion. It's strange how the world keeps spinning as if nothing had happened, while inside you, time stands still. People ask if you need anything, and you say no, but what you really wanted was a chance to hear that voice one more time, just one. Over time, things began to shift. And I'm not talking about the objects in the house. I'm talking about the inside. I began to realize that his absence wasn't a static hole, but a living space. A space that wanted to be filled, not with distractions, but with meaning. That's when I started paying more attention to the little things. A song that would play out of nowhere and remind me of him. A smell that lingered in the air without explanation. A strange sensation, as if someone had just passed by me, and, strange as it may seem, it wasn't frightening, it was comforting. Until then, I'd never talked much about spirituality. I was one of those people who believed in something greater, but didn't quite know what it was. But when pain sets in and certainties disappear, you start searching. And it's not a desperate search for ready-made answers. It's a search for meaning, for signs, for anything that tells you, hey, you're not crazy. There's more than meets the eye. And it was in this openness, in this honest desire for connection, that I began to realize that maybe grief isn't just pain. Maybe it's a door. Every time I thought of my grandfather with longing, something inside me reacted. A memory emerged more clearly. A sense of presence spread. And little by little, I began to understand that signs aren't like messages written in bold letters. They're subtleties. They're internal movements. A sense of sudden peace amidst chaos. A thought that emerges powerfully at just the right moment. A dream that doesn't feel like a dream. There was one day in particular that really stuck with me. I was sitting in the kitchen, making coffee just the way he liked it, without even realizing it. When I smelled that scent, a memory of him came to me so strongly that my eyes filled with tears. And as I looked out the window, the sky was that golden hue he always said was the light God loves. It might seem like a coincidence, and maybe it was. But in that moment, I chose to believe it wasn't. I chose to believe he was there somehow, reminding me to keep going, telling me that pain wasn't the end, but the beginning of a transformation. And that's when something inside me began to shift. The pain remained, but now it was accompanied by a new sensation. It was as if, instead of dragging myself through it, I was beginning to walk with it. And in that walk, with each step, something new revealed itself. As if, behind the longing, there was a silent invitation to something greater, an expansion, a chance to see beyond. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it was precisely in this opening, in this space between pain and presence, that he reappeared. And what happened in that instant completely changed my perception of what is real. It happened on a normal night, one of those nights when everything seems the same, but inside we carry a silent mess. I wasn't expecting anything. I hadn't said any specific prayers or even thought about him before going to sleep. And maybe that's why it was so impactful. Because when the presence came, it didn't ask permission. It simply, he was but. At first, it seemed like any other dream, formless, with random scenes. But suddenly, everything became clear. The setting was an open, silent field, with a soft light, half golden, half blue. There was no sound, but there was no absence either. It was a kind of silence that soothed, that filled, and that was when I saw him. My grandfather was standing a few meters away from me, his entire body enveloped by a light that did not come from outside, but seemed to come from within. He was exactly as I remembered. His posture, the way he crossed his arms, that half smile at the corner of his face that always appeared when he knew he had something important to say. But there was something different, too. Something in his expression held such profound peace that just looking at him made my entire body relax. I tried to speak, but my voice wouldn't come out. And yet, he understood me. No sound was necessary. It was as if the communication were made of essence. And in that moment, he simply smiled, with tenderness, with presence, and pointed. The gesture was simple, but direct. He extended his arm and pointed downward. He pointed to earth. That pierced me, as if something invisible had touched my chest and ignited a memory I hadn't known existed. The gesture wasn't a goodbye, nor a come with me. It was the opposite. It was as if he were saying, without saying it, your place is still there. You have something to do, something to continue. In that moment, I realized it was all too real to be just imagination. I was awake inside something that made me feel more alive than any moment in my daily life. It wasn't a symbolic dream. It was an encounter, one of those encounters that doesn't follow the rules of time or logic, but carries a silent truth you recognize deep in your heart. The scene lasted a few seconds, or an eternity, I can't say, because in that space, time didn't seem to work the way it does here. But when he smiled for the last time and the image began to dissolve, I woke up, and I woke up with tears, not of sadness, of relief, of reconnection. It was as if, for the first time since his departure, something inside me had clicked back into place. The room was dark and silent, but it felt like light inside. I sat up unhurriedly on the bed, staring into space, but with a strange clarity. And in that silence, I understood that I didn't need an explanation. His gesture, that simple gesture toward Earth, said it all. It was a reminder that no matter how much we miss him, there's a reason we're still here. A mission that, even without knowing the details, still awaits us. In the days that followed, I relived that image over and over again, in my thoughts, in my feelings, in my body. And the more I thought about it, the more layers emerged, because that gesture was also about focus, about presence, about turning our gaze to what's before us. How often do we get lost in thoughts of what was, or in fear of what might come, and forget the present? What if his message was exactly that? A call to live with more intention, more awareness, more surrender. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because from that moment on, everything I thought I knew about spirituality, purpose, and presence began to transform in subtle but profound ways. That wasn't just a dream. Even though I woke with my eyes still heavy and the room silent, everything inside me told me it had been more than that. It was as if my body had returned, but something inside me was still there, in that calm field, enveloped by a light that didn't seem like sunlight. The sensation was of lightness, but also of presence. I felt my grandfather as if he had just left the room, not as a memory, but as a real presence. And the strangest thing, or perhaps the most beautiful thing, was that there was no fear, no confusion. Quite the opposite. What remained within me was a peace so profound it was difficult to explain. It wasn't the peace that comes from a good night's sleep or a trouble-free day. It was a kind of tranquility that filled the body from within, as if all questions were somehow suspended. As if just by having experienced it, I already knew more than I did before, even without being able to put it into words. This was one of the first clues that it couldn't just be a figment of my imagination, because unlike other dreams, everything was incredibly clear. I remembered the details of the landscape, the smell of the air, the texture of the light, his clothes, the precise gesture of pointing. I remembered the silence, but also everything that silence said. In ordinary dreams, details fade quickly as if slipping through our fingers. But this scene, it remained, firm, clear, and as the days passed, it didn't fade. On the contrary, it gained new layers of meaning. That's when I realized something even more powerful. My body had felt it too. I woke up with a warm chest, as if my heart had been warmed from within. And the emotional impact of that wasn't like that of a beautiful dream. It was like an experience, a real experience that the brain tries to rationalize, but the spirit has already recognized as true. And when the spirit recognizes it, there's no argument to convince it otherwise. I did some research, trying to understand if other people had experienced something similar, and I came across nearly identical accounts. People who dreamed of loved ones and woke up with the same feeling of profound peace, as if they had truly found themselves again, even if only for a moment. In almost every account, the phrase was similar. It didn't seem like just any dream, and that made me think, what if it wasn't really? We've learned to treat the spiritual world as something distant, too mystical, or simply improbable. But perhaps, just perhaps, spirituality is something closer than we imagine. Something that's constantly trying to manifest itself, but that demands listening. A kind of listening that comes not through the ears, but through feeling, through allowing. And if so, it wouldn't be crazy to think that our loved ones, those with whom we've built true bonds, still find ways to be present. Perhaps out of love, perhaps out of care, perhaps because there's something in us that needs to be remembered, recalled. Like that gesture from my grandfather, simple, direct, yet loaded with meaning. A gesture I keep revisiting, not with my mind, but with my heart. He said nothing. He gave no explanations, but he left a vivid message. And that, for me, is more than enough. Because when the soul hears what it needs, it doesn't need words. It understands and changes. And true change doesn't happen when someone convinces us of something. It happens when something resonates within. When an encounter, even a brief one, leaves marks that reorganize everything. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject. Because when I began living with this new awareness, everything around me also began to change, as if his gesture had initiated a new phase of my journey here. His gesture was simple. No words, no expression beyond the slight smile on his face, and his outstretched arm, his finger pointing firmly toward earth. It was as if time had stopped at that very moment, and I stood there motionless, trying to understand what that meant. It was only later, as the days passed and the questions that wouldn't leave me alone, that I began to realize perhaps that gesture carried a deeper message than any sentence he could have said, pointing to earth. Why? Was he calling me back? Reminding me that my journey is still here? Or was it a sign that something important needed to be done on this plane? Something only I could understand in time. That image of him looking at me sweetly and pointing here felt to me like both a hug and a mission. A way of saying, you have something to accomplish. You're not finished yet. And you know what's most curious? That sense of peace he conveyed seemed to contradict the idea of urgency. There was no rush, but there was purpose. There was no fear, but there was direction. It was as if he were telling me, with a gesture as silent as it was powerful, that there is something on earth that still needs my awakened presence, and not just my physical existence, but my active awareness, my purposeful choices, my genuine contribution, as if he wanted to ensure I wouldn't be distracted from the essence while I'm still here. Perhaps this is the hidden truth behind so many spiritual encounters. They don't come to entertain or move. They come to remind, to awaken, to transform the way we see our lives. How often do we get lost in petty concerns, in the noise of everyday life, in goals that seem grand on the outside but are empty on the inside? What if my grandfather's gesture was precisely to pull me back to the essential, to the real earth, to the ground of life, to what has value? Sometimes spirituality manifests itself as a gentle push, an invisible touch on the shoulder, a look from another plane, and other times, it reveals itself with such force that it becomes impossible to ignore. It's as if, on the other side, there's a love so unconditional, so lucid, that it needs no words. It simply points, shows, delivers, and trusts that you will understand. Since that encounter, I began to see my own journey through a different lens. I began to reevaluate the decisions I was making, the way I was treating time, my feelings, my faith, my mission, and even without understanding everything rationally, something within me reorganized. It's as if I'd received a reminder of where my center is, where my calling lies, and most importantly, where I must remember to be present. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever felt like someone dear to you was trying to show you a direction, a truth that was right there in front of you, but that you hadn't allowed yourself to see yet? After that moment with my grandfather, everything around me seemed the same, but inside, something had shifted profoundly. It wasn't a loud shift, not a sudden revolution, but a kind of quiet realignment, as if my internal compass had been reset. And from that moment on, I began to look at life with more intention, more care, more reverence. The little things took on new weight, and the big things that had previously seemed urgent began to lose ground. Seeing someone you love, someone who's already passed, so clearly pointing us to the here and now, is like receiving a silent wake-up call. I began to notice signs everywhere, not in an exaggerated, mystical way, but real, tangible, like small confirmations that there's something bigger watching us, guiding us, accompanying us, a sound that arrives at just the right time, a familiar scent with no explanation, a coincidence impossible to ignore. Everything seemed charged with new meaning. My faith, which previously oscillated between rituals and doubts, transformed into a living daily presence. No longer about absolute answers, but about conscious presence. I began to meditate more, breathe with more intention, speak less, and listen more. And when I talk about listening, I mean not just with my ears, but with my soul. Listening to what life says when everything else is silent. Listening to what my heart tries to convey when my mind is racing. This new listening has changed the way I relate to everything, to people, to time, to what I do, to what I feel. I also began to question the impact of my actions. If someone on the other side cares so much about what I'm doing here, then what I do here has weight, it has meaning, it has consequences. This brought me a new responsibility, but at the same time, a lightness. Because knowing that we are not alone, not even after death, transforms fear into courage. And even more, it transforms doubt into direction. This experience profoundly changed my mindset. It made me understand that true transformation begins within, in the invisible depths of the soul. Decisions that once seemed small are now made with greater presence. Moments that once went unnoticed are now seen with gratitude. It's as if his gesture left a key, and this key unlocked a new way of existing. No longer on autopilot, no longer in the "I'll figure it out later" mindset, but in the now. And the most interesting thing is that I didn't need to isolate myself from the world to experience this change. On the contrary, I became more present in conversations, more sincere in my emotions, more available in relationships. What once seemed too spiritual now fits naturally into everyday life, because spirituality ultimately isn't about distancing yourself from the earth. It's about being more rooted in it, with awareness, with meaning, with an open heart. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because when we begin to live with this kind of connection, many other things begin to happen. And perhaps you've also felt something similar, a presence, a calling, a sign, something that made you rethink everything. After everything that happened, one of the questions that lingered most in my mind was, how can I keep this connection alive in my daily life? Because it's very common that after an intense spiritual experience, we return to our routine and feel that glow fading. But I understood that this flame doesn't have to be rare, it just needs to be nurtured. Spirituality, when it's real, doesn't reside only in extraordinary moments. It reveals itself in small decisions, in intentional pauses, in gestures that almost no one sees, but that make all the difference. I began to realize that listening to the voice of the invisible isn't about constantly expecting mystical phenomena, but rather developing a sensitivity to grasp the details. Sometimes, a stray phrase in a conversation, a song that plays at just the right time, a seemingly random encounter carries a message that hits home. But to see this, you have to slow down. You have to shift your mindset from one of control to one of listening. Stop trying to understand everything in a hurry and learn to trust what reveals itself slowly. I realized that maintaining a spiritual connection is less about what I do religiously and more about how I live what I believe. It's about caring for people, how I approach my choices, and the presence I bring to my days. It's not about becoming perfect, far from it, but about being present, conscious, and more whole. This is spirituality in motion, and that's how I began to build a new kind of routine, a routine with soul. Every day before opening my phone, I take a few minutes to connect. Sometimes it's a prayer, other times just silence. But I find that when I do this, my entire day changes. Answers come more easily, decisions become clearer, and even difficulties seem to have meaning behind them. It's as if, by aligning myself with something greater from the beginning, I'm giving it permission to guide me the rest of the way. And when this practice becomes consistent, the invisible begins to become familiar. There's also something else that helped me a lot, talking to my grandfather. Even though he was gone, I started writing to him. Letters, thoughts, thanks. At first, it seemed strange, but after a while, it became almost a ritual. I realized that even without a literal response, this communication created a strength within me, a kind of presence that can't be explained in words, but that calms, guides, and sustains. And then I understood a hidden truth that I couldn't access before. True bonds don't die, they only change form. And that became a major turning point, because it stopped being about a beautiful memory and became a living exchange. My grandfather's gesture of pointing to the earth wasn't just a pretty symbol, it was a summons, a call for me to continue walking with more meaning, with more presence, with more dedication. And today, I carry that as a silent reminder in everything I do, on good days and also on those when everything seems confusing. Because on those days, more than ever, that connection sustains me. Over time, I began to realize that my grandfather's gesture, that simple gesture pointing to earth, carried more than a momentary message. It was a kind of profound reminder, something that told me, without words, you still have a lot to live for there, and what you do there matters. A lot. This realization transformed me internally. I began to see that even after our physical departure, the bond with those we love isn't broken. It simply changes location. And if we're open, attentive, and willing to feel with our hearts and not just our eyes, we'll notice they're still there. Maybe not every moment, but the ones that truly matter. It's curious how certain teachings only reveal themselves when we're ready to receive them. For years, I listened to my grandfather's advice, but it wasn't until after he passed that I truly understood what he meant. He always talked about presence, about doing what you do well, about living with purpose, even in simple tasks. And today, this voice that echoes within me doesn't come from any memory. It's almost like a silent compass. When I get distracted from what matters, it calls me back. When I get lost in haste or anxiety, it's as if it's saying, breathe, look again, take it easy. And this has made me choose differently, think differently, live differently. I also understood that everyone's mission here goes beyond what we imagine. Sometimes we think a mission is something grand, visible, recognized by everyone. But my grandfather taught me the opposite. That mission is about consistency. It's about how you treat those around you, the intention with which you do things, the courage to not lose yourself even when the world tries to push you away from your essence. This impacted me in a way no theory could have. And then, something very curious began to happen. Whenever I felt lost, indecisive, or exhausted, some memory of him would surface. A phrase, a scent, an image, as if he were saying, "You are not alone." And I began to realize that true bonds transcend time, space, and even death. There is a kind of love that no longer needs a body to continue existing. A love that becomes direction, protection, courage. A love that transforms into purpose. That's how I began to see life differently. And more than that, I began to live with a different attitude, with more dedication, more presence, more respect for what truly matters. Because when you understand that there is continuity beyond matter, everything takes on new meaning. Even silence becomes more meaningful. Pain transforms into power, and longing becomes a bridge, no longer an abyss. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because there is something essential that many people ignore when they live experiences like this. The emotional background that is revealed when we accept this type of connection as real. What if it were you? If, amidst the silence of dawn, in one of those moments when everything seems most sensitive, you felt a presence, not visible, but real. A vibration in the air, a slight shiver, an insistent thought that seems to come from beyond your mind. What if it were someone you deeply love, trying to cross the invisible veil between worlds just to remind you they're near? Would you recognize them? Or would it go unnoticed, like just another random thought in the middle of the day? The truth is, we're often so immersed in the rush, the distractions, the external demands, that we miss subtle signs that carry valuable messages. And perhaps the greatest challenge isn't seeing or hearing, but allowing ourselves to feel, realizing how much this connection still exists, even without words. Because there's a wisdom in the invisible, a kind of hidden truth that only reveals itself to those willing to open themselves. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there are revelations that only emerge when we look within with sincerity. If you've made it this far, it's because something inside you connected with this story, and that says a lot. Sometimes all we need is a safe space to reflect, feel, and remember that we're not alone. If this video touched your heart in any way, if it brought you peace, answers, or even more questions, consider subscribing to the channel. We're building a community where conversations like this are part of the journey. And tell me in the comments, just so I know you stayed until the end. Right there, this message was for me. It will be so good to know that this exchange reached you. If you want to leave a like, it's already a way of showing that this type of content has meaning, that this connection is worthwhile.